It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the MSI MPG 274URF. As usual for video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what the monitor would look like in person. You can find a link to additional content in the video description, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 27-inch 4K UHD, that's 3840 by 2160 IPS panel, more specifically an AU Optronics AHVA Advanced Hyper Viewing Angle panel. So with this screen size and resolution, you get an exceptional pixel density, very high pixel density. So if you're not using scaling, so at the moment I'm not using scaling, and that's because I'm personally happy to use this monitor without scaling. So I get a massive amount of desktop real estate, but text is very small. It's very crisp, but it is very small. Most people are going to want to use some degree of scaling on a monitor with this kind of pixel density. And if you do, that's not a problem, whether you're using scaling in Windows, whether you're using application-specific zoom. As long as applications are scaling cleanly, and in the vast majority of cases they will be, then you still benefit from the high pixel density. It's just that things become larger. So although this text is larger, you still benefit from the high pixel density in terms of how crisp everything looks. And there's also a lot of detail to suitably high resolution image content, also suitably high resolution movie content, and certainly game content. There's a definite clarity, a 4K UHD look to that, which you just don't get on models with a significantly lower pixel density, such as a 27-inch QHD model. And there's an article on the website, which is linked to in the video description, all about the 4K UHD experience. It's written from the perspective of a 28-inch 4K UHD screen, but that gives a very similar experience in terms of the pixel density to this 27-inch 4K model. I'll now take a look at the refresh rates and some associated features of the monitor with the 3840 by 2160 resolution. This is shown here using DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, and it will support a 10-bit color signal at the same time. You can use VRR at the same time, Nvidia G-Sync compatible or AMD FreeSync, and you can also use HDR at the same time if you wish. Using HDMI 2.1, the same refresh rates are listed, again up to 160 Hz. Now it supports up to 12 bits per channel. For most users, this won't make a difference because for the most content you consume, it's not 12-bit content. You don't need to use this signal. It's not going to give you any advantage. But it's just to show you that if you want to or need to use this, you can use the 12-bit signal via HDMI 2.1. And again, you've got access to VRR. That includes HDMI 2.1 VRR as well as adaptive sync. So AMD FreeSync and Nvidia G-Sync compatible can both be used. And you could use HDMI 2.1 VRR on the PS5, which doesn't support adaptive sync, for example. And HDR is also supported at the same time if you wish. So yes, these are full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, 48 gigabits per second for those interested. And this list shows some additional refresh rates supported by the monitor for its native resolution. Note that the lowest supported is 29 Hz. The monitor doesn't include a 24 Hz mode. I'm now going to talk about the scaling, the interpolation process of the monitor. Just be aware that what you see on the video will not accurately represent what you'll see firsthand using the monitor, but people still like me to go through this, so I will do that. I'm currently running the monitor at its native 3840 by 2160, so the monitor isn't using any scaling or interpolation, it's just displaying everything natively. But an interpolation scaling process is supported for various lower resolutions, such as 2560 by 1440, and that's set up to 144 Hz. Just be aware that if you select 160 Hz, then the monitor won't be using scaling, but if you're a PC user, you can use GPU scaling if you want 160 Hz. And the scaling process used by the monitor, it offers reasonable sharpness at this resolution. It's not quite as sharp and crisp as a native QHD model of this size, but I've certainly seen worse without adjusting any sharpness or anything else in the monitor if such options are available, and in this case they are available. So in image, for example, there's the sharpness control, that's the main one. You can increase that as high as 5, with 0 being the default, the filter's disabled, so to speak. Now, if you're going as high as 5, things look really sort of, I'd say paper-like, really very overly crisp and over-sharpened and quite artificial. I know some people do actually like that look, so you can do that if you want, but I'd recommend not going as high as 5. I think 2 maintains quite a good neutral look to the image without strong over sharpening, and it does offset some of the softening of the interpolation process pretty well actually. So again, it's personal preferences, but I think perhaps increasing this as high as 2 is worth doing. The QHD resolution. I've just reset the sharpness control to 0, and there's another one, image enhancement in professional. It's a bit of a different sharpness filter really. It has a bit of a different effect. Set to weak, it has, I'd say, moderate over sharpening in places, but some people won't mind this look and might quite like it. With medium, things really start to look really filtered and odd, and anything beyond that, that goes to an extreme level. If you select the full HD resolution at 144Hz, or what's around at 244Hz, then the monitor shows it's running 2560 by 1440, 144Hz. I don't know why it displays it like that. It is actually the full HD resolution it's displaying, so a little bit curious. At refresh rates such as 120Hz or 60Hz, it will correctly report 1920 by 1080. Anyway, I'll just stick to this. So I haven't got any additional sharpness filter applied on the monitor. This is just the native look. And there's quite a significant degree of extra softening. Things really do look quite soft. Obviously things are not going to ever look amazing on a 27-inch Full HD monitor because it's still an incredible pixel density, but you'd still get more sharpness than this natively on that kind of screen. So I would definitely advise trying to use the sharpness filter. Again, image enhancement. The weak setting even looks a bit artificial and over sharpened. Some elements look too soft and others look over sharpened. It looks a bit odd. And any higher than that, things really look very funky indeed. Not a nice look. But again, if you set the sharpness control up to 2, that offsets the softening pretty nicely. With this resolution, I'd probably want to go a little bit higher, maybe to 3. And with that, I feel it's a pretty decent Full HD representation. So overall, interpolation process on this monitor is actually very good. It's very usable for both the QHD and the Full HD resolutions, with the appropriate sharpness settings applied. In image, there is a screen size option which has a few different scaling settings. So auto is the default. That's what I've just been showing you, where it's using interpolation, using all of the pixels of the screen. But you can enforce 4:3, 16:9, because this is a Full HD resolution, that looks the same as it does with auto. 16:10, and 1:1, which is a 1:1 pixel mapping setting. And that will only use the pixels called for by the source resolution. I know from another MSI monitor I've tested, the reason it did that is because it's now just disabled adaptive sync, so I had that enabled. You need to disable adaptive sync if you want to use the 1:1 setting. So I can now go back to screen size and select 1:1. And there's a big black border for the unused pixels and a perfect undistorted Full HD image in the middle of the screen. If you're using the QHD resolution, then it will look like that. So a smaller black border, but still pretty big. I'm just going to select Full HD 144Hz to see what size of screen it decides to display. It does actually show 2560 by 1440 with a 1:1 setting rather than Full HD. So you have a bit of a bigger screen space if you like that kind of thing. From the front you can see that there is extensive use of dark matte plastics, so there's no coated metal. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know I'm often saying how I'm a fan of coated metal, and again I would have liked to have seen some here, but the plastic used isn't super cheap or hollow feeling. It's not too bad in that respect. The base is weighted as well, so it doesn't feel too flimsy, and the screen doesn't have excessive wobble if it's tapped from the side or anything like that. The top and side bezels use what I like to call a dual stage design, so there's a slim panel border flush with the rest of the screen, which is difficult to see when the screen is switched off as it is now, but easy to see when the screen is switched on as it is elsewhere in the video. And then there's a thin, hard plastic outer component to the bezel as well. So as far as gaming monitors go, reasonably compact design really. I would classify the screen surface of this one as light matte anti-glare. So where you have strong, bright, direct light, you can sometimes get a bit of a glassy look to things, but it's not the same as a glossy screen surface where you can get sharper reflections or anything like that. They're just glare patches, but they're not as strongly diffused as they are on some matte anti-glare screen surfaces. It also has some positive impacts compared to those stronger matte anti-glare screen surfaces, and I'll touch upon those in the contrast section. The overall glare handling of this one is still good. The stand offers full ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt the screen backwards and forwards a little bit, swivel it left and right, pivot it into portrait, and you can also adjust the height by 110mm or 4.73 inches. This is what it looks like at lowest stand height. Pretty low down, quite close to the desk. That's at maximum stand height. So not a massive amount of height adjustment, 110mm, enough for most people. But if you're particularly tall or depending on your desk, you might want to consider an alternative stand or mount. At the rear, lots more dark matte plastic, also some glossy elements such as the back of the stand neck there, this here which is an RGB lighting element. Pretty pointless one to be honest, you can only really see it from the back. This just shows the default behaviour of the lighting, so it just cycles through various colours of the spectrum. You can customise it using MSI software or apps if you prefer, but it's really just something you can appreciate from the back. It does very little when you're viewing the monitor from the front. Also a little glossy MSI dragon there. And for a little bit of contrast, the OSD control joystick, which is red. The stand attaches centrally, and if you remove it or don't attach it in the first place, then there's provision for 75 by 75mm VESA mounting. Interestingly, I think it was just an issue with my unit. It didn't seem to include additional screws. When I first assembled the stand, it looked like this. You'll see that the monitor has 2 screws at the top there. If you're using the included stand, you don't need to use those screws. They're just sitting there covering some holes for neatness. So I unscrewed them, screwed them into the included stand, and it all attached just fine. But I'm not sure if this is what you're supposed to have to do. I've never had to do this with the monitor before. It could be that my unit just, as a review sample, didn't include these additional screws that it should. The ports of the monitor face downwards. There's a DC power input. The monitor has an external power brick. There is a USB Type-B upstream port plus 2 USB 2.0 downstream ports, 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, and a USB-C port with 65 watts of power delivery, DP alt mode, and upstream data. So the monitor does include KVM functionality, and you can quickly and easily switch between multiple systems and assign the USB peripherals to a given system with a quick switch in the OSD, and that includes with shortcut keys in the OSD, which you can set up for easy access. And last but not least, there's a 3.5mm headphone jack. The monitor does not include any integrated speakers. There's also a case slot at the bottom of the screen, towards the right side when you're viewing it from the rear. Taking a quick look now at the subpixel layout, it has a standard RGB, red, green and blue stripe subpixel layout. This is the standard subpixel layout, and there are no odd quirks with the subpixels, so I don't have any concerns related to text clarity or anything like that, and that's a definite strength of this model actually. This text clarity is excellent. Moving on now to the calibration of the monitor, this table shows the monitor tested with various different conditions, and it shows gamma and white point readings taken using a Datacolor Spider X Elite colorimeter. So with all conditions tested, 2.2 average gamma, which is good to see. I will be looking at this in a little bit more detail shortly. The white point out of the box was close to 800K, so a little bit on the cool side, but nothing too dramatic on my unit. I also like to test the low blue light setting just to show what that does to the colour temperature, and in this case it dropped it to 5342K, so that gives a warm look to things, and this particular setting also gives a greenish tint because it maintains a strong green channel whilst massively reducing the blue channel. So I don't personally like that greenish yellow tint, and that's why I've also included a look at colour temperature warm, which is an alternative low blue light setting. It's equally effective really. It has a similar white point, but it also reduces the green colour channel significantly, and therefore it gives a warm amber tint rather than a green to yellow tint, and I find my eyes are able to adjust to that tint more readily. So these are the kind of settings that you might like to consider using in the evening or other times where you feel that might be more restful on the eyes. With my test settings I was able to get close to my 2.2 gamma target and 6500K white point target, and of course balanced the green colour channel nicely. And you'll see under the table the conditions I used for my test settings, and there's also a best settings video which explores this in a bit more detail. And there's also a little note there just saying that individual units and preferences vary, these won't be optimal in all cases, and also that ICC profiles, they're not used in the review, but I have included a few in the video description if you want to try them out. One was created using the test settings and the other using Pro Mode sRGB with everything at default for that particular preset. This graph shows the gamma tracking under my test settings, and it was pretty similar out of the box. So there's quite tight tracking of the 2.2 curve, no massive deviations here. As usual, I also looked at things in a bit more detail than you can see in this graph, and there were no major concerns. And the main area that I like to see tracking the 2.2 curve tightly is the lower end, because issues there can make details far too masked or far too unmasked if the gamma isn't close to 2.2 target. But I was pleased to see in this case there wasn't any massive deviation. Perhaps just a very minor masking of detail, but not a massive deviation from the 2.2 curve. And this shows the gamma tracking using the sRGB setting, Pro Mode equal to sRGB. It's actually a bit tighter to the 2.2 curve for some of the midtones, and really very good overall tracking with this setting. Be aware that it does track the 2.2 curve rather than tracking sRGB, so you don't get an elevation of dark shades where things are less masked than they would be for the 2.2 curve, because if you're strictly following the sRGB gamma curve, then that does give an uplift to dark shades. It reduces the gamma for dark shades, whereas the 2.2 curve, which is followed by the monitor and many monitors, does not have that effect. A quick look now at the colour accuracy using the sRGB setting. Very good overall. Shade 1F, if you've seen my videos before, you will notice that 1F is usually the highest error. That's because the colorimeter is super sensitive to slight differences in the green versus blue balance for this shade, so don't worry too much about that particular outlier. It's a very specific shade. Most of these shades are presented very nicely. The average delta E recorded in this test was 1.09, which is strong. If I extend out to the Spider Checker 48 test patch collection, which includes twice as many shades, then you'll see again a strong performance here. Actually, the average has now dropped to a delta E of 0.93, and again it's that 6.09, which is the outlier for the shade 1F cerulean. Other shades are much stronger than that. Moving on now to the contrast and brightness performance of the monitor. So this table here shows some readings taken using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus, which would now be marketed as a Calibrite Color Checker Display Plus. So white luminance readings, black luminance readings, and calculated contrast ratios. So the monitor comes close to the specified 1000:1 static contrast ratio with all of the conditions tested here, including under the test settings with some adjustments made. I got 1006:1. So not an amazing contrast, but really quite typical for the panel, and again it's as specified. The brightness was pretty impressive actually. It went up to 506 nits and it went as low as 39 nits. So that's a really nice brightness adjustment range. It means it'll go bright enough for many people, including those that like their monitors pretty bright. And it'll go dim enough for most people, including some who are pretty sensitive to brightness. It's also worth noting that the monitor is flicker free as advertised. It uses DC dimming rather than PWM, pulse width modulation. I took a few readings using eco mode here just to kind of show you what that does. So at 100% brightness and 0% brightness, it's the same as the user setting. And by the way, if it's not specified, I do test this monitor with the user setting. But at 50% brightness, you got 113 nits with the eco setting and 277 with the user setting. So basically what eco does is it changes the mapping of the brightness. So your maximum brightness is the same, your minimum brightness is the same, but between that you might get some lower values if you've got eco selected. So for example, if you keep the monitor at its default setting of 70, I believe it is, or you lower that a bit to 50, then you're going to get a lower brightness if you've got eco selected. Therefore the monitor will draw less power. Of course, the better thing to do is just to adjust brightness according to your own preferences. Certainly try and lower it if you can and it's comfortable for you, and that will save power whether or not you've got eco selected. I also show some readings here with the Pro Mode settings. There's sRGB, Adobe RGB, and Display P3. These are emulation settings, so they will clamp the gamut so it corresponds to the appropriate color space, so sRGB, Adobe RGB, or Display P3, but that doesn't negatively affect the contrast or the brightness performance. Let's jump into some gameplay now. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And the monitor, as you'd expect from around 1000:1 static contrast, you're not getting an amazing experience, especially if you're sitting in a dark room as I am now. In addition to the static contrast, you have to consider IPS glow. You can see a moderate amount of that. So that's a bloom or a haze which emanates from the corners of the screen, and it affects the dark detail and the atmosphere. And it has a cool tint, a bit of a bluish quality to it in places. It's something which is brought out more strongly if you're sitting closer to the screen, if you're using a higher brightness setting, and also if your unit has some issues with backlight bleed or clouding. My unit, as it happens, does have a bit of clouding, mainly towards the bottom right, which does bring out that IPS glow a bit more strongly there. Well, there's not an extreme amount of clouding on my unit or anything like that, but this does vary between individual units. Moving on to some positives when it comes to the contrast experience. The gamma consistency is very strong, as you'd hope for from an IPS model. And what that means is that the level of dark detail, except for where it's affected by IPS glow, it's quite consistent throughout the screen. And as I mentioned earlier with respect to gamma, there's perhaps a little bit of masking of dark detail, but nothing severe. It tracks the 2.2 curve pretty well overall. So you get really an appropriate level of dark detail, at least within the confines of the 1000:1 static contrast ratio and that IPS glow. But it doesn't have the kind of issues you have with VA models, where you can have black crush centrally and excessive detail further out peripherally, or TN model, where you get a gradient of detail from top to bottom because of gamma shifts. The gamma is more consistent than that. I've brightened the room up so I'm not sitting in a cave anymore, and you'll notice that that really does draw the eye away from that IPS glow and indeed just the general weaknesses in the static contrast. They're just less obvious. And indeed the sort of gulf in contrast performance between this and even an OLED monitor, or certainly a VA LCD, is just less apparent in brighter conditions like this. I mean, it's not a super bright room, but it is moderately bright at the moment. I've got some nice natural light streaming in, and some of that is striking the screen surface, so you do get a bit of glare on the screen in places as well. Certainly when you're viewing darker content, as I am now. But it's just to show you that some of the weaknesses I talk about here, they're really a lot more apparent where the room is dimly lit. If you like the room to be quite dark, then do consider some bias lighting behind the monitor or some sort of lighting behind the monitor. It can aid perceived contrast and also help with viewing comfort. So considering brighter shades such as the nice fire here, the screen surface does have a bit of graininess to it, but it's not an extreme amount of graininess. It's what I describe as a bit of a misty graininess, really. It doesn't have a heavily smeared quality or anything like that. Because of the light matte anti-glare screen surface, it doesn't have a huge amount of layering in front of the image. There's reasonably direct emission of light as far as matte screen surfaces go. It's something I'm very sensitive to. I think most people will be pretty happy with this matte screen surface. It offers good glare handling without some of the negative consequences of a stronger matte screen surface. And also when I talk about glare, remember that sometimes if the light is strong enough, you might have a bit of a sharper look to those glare patches. With a stronger matte screen surface, what happens is the screen surface will diffuse that light more heavily, so you won't necessarily get sharper reflections, but you'd get more diffused glare on the screen, which does flood the image, regardless of what you're looking at on the screen. And I've got to explore colour reproduction, and to start off I like to talk about colour consistency using Lagom, lagom.nl, the website, and the tests for viewing angles. The Lagom text test, that looks a blended grey throughout the screen with a bit of red striping to the text, but there aren't obvious shifts between red, orange and green with a bit of head movement or when you look at different sections of the screen. So that indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, which you'd hope to see from an IPS model. The pink block looks a pinkish purple throughout the screen. It does not appear like it looks in the video with this pink blob centrally and then purple further out. It does look very slightly duller, slightly less pink, a little bit more of a bluish purple towards the extreme edges of the screen, but it's a slight shift. The red block appears pretty consistent, rich red throughout the screen. Again, very slightly duller towards the extreme edges, but it doesn't have a strong vignetting effect or anything like that, so it's not an extreme shift between the central regions and the edges. The green block appears pretty consistent yellowish-green chartreuse throughout the screen, slightly yellower towards the extreme edges, and I mean extreme edges in this case. It's really more to do with the panel border, the dual stage panel border, which does pinch a bit at the edges and can cause a little bit of pressure there, rather than anything to do with viewing angles for this shade. The blue block appears a good rich royal blue throughout the screen. I'm now in Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. This monitor has a very generous colour gamut, and if you consider content like this game, which is running under SDR, or games running under SDR, or if you're just on a desktop browsing the internet, or you're watching a movie or video content, then generally that's going to be designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. And if the monitor has a wider colour gamut than that, or you're using a wider colour gamut than that on the monitor, then things are going to look oversaturated. There's going to be extra saturation and extra vibrancy. The colour gamut of this one, I've got it up on the screen now, Very generous indeed, as you can see. It covers 97% DCI-P3, that's what I measured with my colorimeter and using the software. The exact measurement would depend on the software you're using and the device you're using to measure, but you can see a lot of extension beyond DCI-P3 as well, and I recorded 97% Adobe RGB coverage for those interested. So that's really where the quantum dot LED backlight comes in. It pushes beyond the normal boundaries you'd see from a traditional wide gamut monitor using KSF phosphors. So with this, I'm observing this content and there's a lot of saturation. The ground there, the sand, it has a orangey red push, and you can see the same to skin tones as well because of the very generous gamut in the red region and the orange region for that matter. This orange bit of plastic here as well really stands out in an obvious way. It is sort of a bright reddish orange, more reddish than it should appear, but definitely eye-catching. The palm trees, they show some quite lush greens, but some of the bright greens are a bit overdone. They look slightly neon in places, not so bad in this particular scene, but just in general, the greens look overdone, oversaturated. And the sky blues as well, lots of extra pop there, bit of a cartoonish look. So really the overall look is just decidedly vibrant, but you get plenty of variety, and some people are going to really like this look. The green here, by the way, just really caught my eye, quite literally, because it looks quite artificial. Certainly brighter than it should look. Anyway, if you don't like this look and you want to tone things down, you want things to look more as the developers intend, you might want to use the sRGB setting. Pro Mode sRGB. You can't adjust the color temperature or the contrast with this setting. There are no gamma settings on this monitor, but you can adjust the brightness. The color gamut now looks like this. So I've got 95% sRGB coverage, so there's a bit of under coverage. The clamp is a little bit overzealous, you might say, but 95% sRGB is still pretty good, and there's no overextension to speak of beyond sRGB, so it does clamp the gamut effectively. And certainly when I'm looking at things here, much more toned down look than what I was observing before. So the green there looks more natural, and the green shades in general, less pop to them, look generally more as intended. The sky blue as well, it's toned down, it looks more natural, less cartoonish. And indeed the sand, it looks more of a neutral sandy tone without the kind of orangey red push. And if I were to observe skin tones, I would see them looking more in place. But some people find sRGB too restrictive because it is a rather restrictive colour space, and there's certainly plenty of colours in the real world that you would see that would be beyond the sRGB colour space, or there might be colours that you want to see on the monitor which are beyond the sRGB colour space. And there are some alternative gamut clamp options on this one. So there's Adobe RGB, for example. Pro Mode Adobe RGB. With this you get a lot of coverage in the orange region of the gamut and the green region of the gamut, and also for cyan, so really between the green and blue edge. So the sky now has quite a bit of pop to it, and some of the greens again look rather eye-catching. There's quite an orangey quality to the sand, and flames really stand out in quite an obvious way with very strong oranges, and sort of goldy yellows are pulled a bit too much towards the orange side of things, that kind of thing. And again, quite an eye-catching look to these orange plastics, but not quite as much as using the native gamut, but certainly more than using the sRGB setting. So the gamut now looks like this with this Adobe RGB setting. This is compared to the Adobe RGB color space. You get 94% Adobe RGB coverage. So that's down from 97% using the native gamut. So again, a bit of coverage is lost, but the over coverage is sorted out. Another alternative would be to use the DCI P3 setting or the Display P3 setting. Pro Mode Display P3. This is really like a more toned down version of the native gamut. It's certainly a far more vibrant approach than with the sRGB setting. And compared to the Adobe RGB setting, well, it tones down the skies. They're not quite as toned down as with the sRGB setting, but more so than with the Adobe RGB or the native gamut. A bit of an orangey push to the sand again, but not too strong. The greens look pretty appropriate. They're quite vibrant, but they're not really overdone in quite the same way as using some of the other color space settings. Definitely a bit of extra pop, but just not to an extreme degree. And using this Display P3 setting, this is what the color gamut looks like. There's now 93% DCI P3 coverage, so you've lost several percentage points compared to the native 97% that I recorded. But again, it's very effective in clamping the gamut and getting rid of over coverage. Just switched back over to my test settings. So this monitor is very versatile because of its exceptional color gamut. If you want to be using it for color critical work, as usual, I would recommend, if you can, calibrating it with your own colorimeter or similar device using a setting that uses the native gamut, so you've got the maximum gamut potential and you've got the color channels unlocked on the monitor. But if you don't have access to that, the color space emulation settings are useful to have, and with the potential of nearly full DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB coverage, it's really good for work in extended color spaces. And you also have to bear in mind the strong color consistency, which I mentioned with reference to Lagom earlier. That is something which you observe more generally, so it means that a given shade appears quite similar whether it's displayed in the center of the screen or towards the edges of the screen or anywhere else on the screen. There aren't clear shifts, so that's of course nice when it comes to perceived color accuracy, but just generally means that the monitor can maintain its vibrancy and its saturation throughout the screen. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running the game under HDR, and I'm going to talk about the HDR performance of the monitor. I'm not going to spend too long on this aspect because this is a very basic HDR performance. It's VESA Display HDR 400 certified, this monitor, which is really nothing to shout about. And this was before the slightly enhanced certification level that is now used for VESA Display HDR 400. But anyway, don't get too bogged down by the certifications. What you've got here is a backlight which is controlled as a single unit. There's no local dimming, and it stays at a similar level to maximum brightness under SDR. So I recorded a white luminance under HDR of 497 nits and a white point of around 6700K, so a slight cool tint, but nothing major on my unit. But you'll be able to see in the video even that the medium shades and the darker shades, they're really sapped of depth because that backlight is just staying at a high level. There's no dynamic contrast used either, so even if the screen is showing predominantly dark shades, it doesn't dim the backlight. It just stays at this maximum level, so it really doesn't achieve the kind of look you would hope for under HDR. Yes, you do get 10-bit color processing, and that can enhance the nuanced shade variety, as I usually say, so a greater variety of closely matching dark shades, but given the backlight control or lack thereof, it really doesn't do justice to that, and it doesn't hammer home that advantage in any appreciable way. I'm not saying there's no advantage from it, it's just that it really doesn't deliver the kind of nuanced shade variety you'd get if there was significantly enhanced dimming precision. And the brightness as well, I mean, it's pretty bright, so the look here, the brightness is pretty good, but there isn't really the contrast between the brightness and the darker elements. Jumping into the water now. Again, the bright elements, you know, they're reasonably bright, but again, you're limited to a maximum of around 500 nits. Of course, some monitors under HDR will show bright elements like the glint on the water surface there, twice this brightness or more. And there's also that lack of contrast here between the bright elements and the surrounding medium shades and the darker shades. Not too much more to say about it really with respect to contrast. Color reproduction, I'm just going to stay on the same scene and briefly mention that because I really don't want to spend too long exploring HDR on this monitor. It's really not something I'd buy this monitor for specifically. Well, the colours don't look washed out, which is good, except when you consider the depth of some of these shades, as I mentioned before, because of the poor backlight control. It doesn't have the depth it should have to some of the shades, but considering these saturation levels and sort of how colourful things look in general, I guess you could say, well, they're pretty good, but actually a bit overdone. So the greens there, I wouldn't say they look neon, but they look sort of overly vibrant, more vibrant than they should. The water as well, that looks pretty eye-catching, a bit on the overdone side, but not too bad. And the rocks there, they don't look quite as neutral as they should. But all of these shades I've just mentioned, they're still toned down compared to if you were to view this under SDR and use the full native gamut. It's just that there's a bit of what I would call artistic license going on here, where some of these shades are still being oversaturated under HDR. And you do have a very generous colour gamut. You certainly get very generous DCI-P3 coverage here and quite a bit of extension beyond that in the gamut, so good Rec 2020 coverage. And under HDR, developers are able to target these wider colour spaces such as DCI-P3 and ultimately Rec 2020. So the monitor can output some really strong vibrancy where it's warranted, but again, general oversaturation of some of the shades that should look more muted, and a lack of depth to some of the dark and medium shades just because of the lack of precision in the backlight. Some people might kind of like how HDR looks on this monitor just for a bit of extra variety, but I think for many people the locked high brightness and the overall representation won't be as well balanced or as visually comfortable as the SDR representation. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This is a 160Hz monitor. I've got the game running at a good solid 160 frames a second. Try and make the most out of the monitor in terms of its refresh rate. And this fairly high frame rate and refresh rate combination brings with it a few advantages. It improves the connected feel, which describes the fluidity and the precision you feel when you're interacting with the game world. It's vastly better in that respect than a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz, or the game running at 60 frames a second. This connected feel is also aided by low input lag. In this case, I measured a nice round 2 milliseconds of input lag, so that indicates a very low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel. So even sensitive users should be fine with this monitor in that respect. The other advantage of the good frame rate and refresh rate is that it decreases the perceived blur due to eye movement. So perceived blur is a topic which is explored in an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, but basically it's contributed to by two main sources. One is the movement of the eyes as you track motion on the screen, and that's closely linked to the refresh rate of the display, assuming a suitably high frame rate as well. The other aspect is pixel responsiveness. That also contributes to perceived blur. So there's a nice photography technique called pursuit photography, which uses a moving rather than static camera to capture motion on the screen using Test UFO. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, Blurbuster's Test UFO. So here are some pursuit photographs using that test. The monitor's running at 160Hz and various different response time settings are tested. Normal, fast and fastest, so all of the response time settings are tested. And a reference screen is also shown there. This is a fast IPS model, the ViewSonic VX2728J-2K. That's running at 165Hz, but the extra 5Hz makes a negligible difference in this test or just in general. So it's very much can be considered an apples to apples comparison still. But basically, this monitor is showing a good performance using its fast setting. The fastest setting introduces obvious colourful inverse ghosting. You can see trailing behind the UFO, which is pretty colourful, pretty inky looking. And the normal setting, that uses some slower than optimal pixel responses. The fast setting, though, it comes closer to the reference screen, actually slightly faster than the reference screen for some of the transitions shown here. And the reference screen is already at a level which the vast majority of users who are considering a monitor like this or 160Hz or so monitor are going to be perfectly happy with. Definitely a strong showing from the MSI here using its fast setting. Minor weaknesses, a little bit of what I call powdery trailing in places, particularly for the darker background, which is the top row shown there, but even that is not extreme. For those preferring numbers, here are some numbers using the OSRTT Pro tool, the same tool and methodology used by TFT Central, although they use their own color coding system. Just be aware of different methodologies used by different reviewers if you're trying to compare this to other models. The table here, the first table, that shows initial response time readings, and this is using the normal overdrive setting, so the slowest setting of the monitor. And even then it's not super slow, but there's certainly some golden orangey colour here and a bit of red as well, and a bit of green, depends on the transition you're looking at. The average initial time is 5.13 milliseconds, which is okay but not ideal for 160Hz. You'll see very little overshoot, lots of green there, nothing of concern. Bumping up to the fast setting now, I know it says overdrive normal on the image, sorry that was my mistake, I inputted it incorrectly in the little sort of text field there. It's definitely using the fast setting. So there is a little bit of overshoot now, but not an extreme amount by any means. And it does speed the pixel transitions up a bit overall, so the average initial time has dropped from 5.13 milliseconds to 4.24 milliseconds. The slowest transition measured, it's actually 10.4 milliseconds, whereas with the normal setting it was 9.2 milliseconds. So that one is slightly slower, but this is an imperceptible difference in practice. However, I do notice just generally the monitor performing better, as I showed you with Test UFO, using this setting over normal, and because it comes with very little overshoot consequence, I do definitely consider this the optimal setting. And if you're a speed freak and you want to use fastest, well, you're going to be dealing with a heck of a lot of overshoot. So you can see lots of red with the overshoot graph now. There is a reduction in the average initial time from 4.24 milliseconds to 3.12 milliseconds. Interestingly, that slowest response time setting is again 10.4, so a bit slower than I measured with the normal setting, but really it's neither here nor there. But interestingly, if you look at the extreme contrast overshoot values, so starting from black or starting from white, so 0 or 255, in other words, the first and the last column on the overshoot graph, you'll see that's all green. The monitor is deciding not to really put much acceleration into those pixel transitions. And actually for those transitions, that's where the overshoot is potentially most noticeable, because it can really stand out against the background. Bright halo trailing could really stand out against a much darker background. And likewise, dark, dirty trailing from overshoot could stand out very strongly against a bright background. So it sort of makes sense in a way what they've done here, but you could argue that they could have accelerated these transitions a little bit more without going to an extreme level. I'm using my preferred fast setting, and really again, just as shown with the other tests, there aren't really any obvious standout weaknesses at all. Just minor weaknesses, a little bit of powdery trailing in places. Again, it's for the high contrast transitions, which IPS models will often show some weaknesses with. But IPS models can easily be a bit slower than this. I know I showed you with the reference screen a little bit slower than this, and that reference screen is already quite a fast IPS model. Good performance by the MSI here, really. So some of the little details, like the brickwork there, and if I look at the white text there against the medium to darker backgrounds, yeah, a little bit of powdery trailing, sort of weaknesses you wouldn't get on an OLED or a super fast TN model perhaps, although actually some TN models which are fast even show some isolated weaknesses for some of these transitions. Anyway, what I'm saying here is it's not a perfect performance, but it's still definitely strong. I'm on another scene on Battlefield 5, and this one has some transitions which are more towards the high contrast end, so there are lots of darker and bright shades intertwining. And here the monitor, again, minor weaknesses, a little bit of powdery trailing in places, adds a small amount of extra perceived blur, but actually many IPS models will show more of this, and VA models definitely will commonly show far more pronounced weaknesses. There's nothing anywhere near smeary trailing here. These weaknesses are very much on the minor side. And there's really nothing in the way of overshoot here, the other scene, or just more generally that I would complain about, just little traces here and there, just like what was shown with the measurements. It's nothing that really punches you in the face or anything like that. If you do like overshoot that punches you in the face, you could use the fastest setting, so I'm just going to switch over to that. And you should be able to see this in the video quite readily around the makeshift roof there. Strong overshoot, obvious bright halo trailing, stands out in an obvious way. So I do think the overshoot here is on the undesirable end. Even if you're a competitive gamer, I think this could be potentially distracting. Of course, it's very subjective. I suppose some people might want to use this, but really the monitor performs so well, in my opinion, using its fast setting, that the kind of edge you would get using this fastest setting isn't really worth it. And it doesn't affect the input lag, certainly not the signal delay element of that anyway. So I think the fast setting is really going to be preferred for most people. So I'm going to switch back to that. I've now got the game running at 120 frames a second. The monitor is matching that with 120 Hz. The monitor supports VRR, variable refresh rate technologies. You can use adaptive syncs, you can use Nvidia's G-Sync compatible and AMD FreeSync. It also has HDMI 2.1 VRR support. That means you could use Nvidia's G-Sync compatible using HDMI 2.1 as well. You could also use VRR on the PS5 because that doesn't support adaptive sync, but it can use HDMI 2.1 VRR. So lots of flexibility in terms of VRR on this monitor. The claimed range of operation is 48 to 160 Hz, but as I often find, the floor of operation, it was sometimes closer to 55 Hz, 55 frames a second, but below this LFC, low frame rate compensation, is used. So that means if the game was running at 40 frames a second, then the monitor could be running at 80 Hz, and that will give a nice even division between the frame and refresh rate, and that keeps tearing and stuttering at bay, much as VRR is intending to do anyway. Something to be aware of is that if you're frequently crossing that LFC boundary, so around 48 to 55 Hz, it does depend on the fluctuations occurring. It's not an exact cutoff, but if you're frequently around that area and you might be going either side of the boundary, then there's a subtle momentary stuttering, but this isn't specific to this monitor. It's something I always observe with LFC, but it's not as obnoxious as the stuttering you might see from normal frame and refresh rate mismatches when you're not using VRR. It's not necessarily going to be an issue for everyone anyway. And I didn't observe any issues with VRR flickering on this monitor. Furthermore, it uses variable overdrive, or certainly enough variable overdrive to ensure that there isn't a strong amount of overshoot, even as the refresh rate decreases. So remember, 120 frames a second at the moment, 120 Hz, but there's not a strong amount of overshoot. So let's look at that with some objective data. So this is with the monitor running at 120 Hz and pursuit photographs. And again, it does well with its fast setting. and slightly outperforms the reference screen. It's quite similar to the reference screen actually at 120 Hz, but it doesn't have obvious overshoot using the fast setting, and does offer a superior performance to using normal, so you might as well use fast. The fastest setting, on the other hand, that introduces a lot of overshoot, so it's not really a very attractive setting. So some figures now, using the normal overdrive setting at 120 Hz, quite a bit of orange on the graph, bit of green, 5.04 milliseconds initial time. Actually not too bad for 120 Hz even with the normal setting, but some room for improvement. And indeed, improvement you get using the fast setting. Things overall edge more towards the green than the orange side of things now. Again, the highest value here has risen a little bit to 8.6 milliseconds, whereas it was 7.6 milliseconds before, but that isn't an obvious difference in practice for this specific transition, and the average initial time has dropped from 5.04 milliseconds to 4.14 milliseconds. And this has occurred without the monitor incurring an obvious overshoot penalty. Again, you could argue that for some of these transitions it could have sped things up a little bit more. So for the first column there, where you got the maximum value of 8.6, probably could have sped that up a little bit, but they seem to want to take a cautious approach, and the overall balance they've achieved here is still very good. Using the fastest setting, the overall balance is less good, and that's because of all of the overshoot, but it does speed things up. The average initial time has dropped from 4.14 milliseconds to 2.98 milliseconds. There's still some deeper orange shades on the graph, but there's a little bit more green. But for most users, that overshoot is going to be more of an obvious issue. And what about 60 Hz, 60 frames a second? Well, VRR is still doing its thing. The connected field has dropped off a lot, but that's just because of the decrease in frame rate. The monitor can't help you with that, but it's still getting rid of the tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. I haven't observed any VRR flickering of note, not just in this scene, but just in general on this monitor, which is nice. And another nice thing is that there isn't any overshoot of particular note either. And I'm still using my preferred fast setting. I haven't switched from that. I can use that throughout the entire VRR range, so I do consider this to be a single overdrive mode experience. So here are the pursuit photographs. Again, the fast setting, I consider that to be optimal. Although normal performs pretty well actually at 60 Hz anyway. Fastest, interestingly, actually has less noticeable overshoot than at higher refresh rates, at least for the transitions shown with test UFO here. The monitor performing slightly better in my opinion than the reference screen, so that's good. Nice solid 60 Hz performance for these transitions. So some numbers now. For the normal setting, not a bad performance for 60 Hz. Average initial time 5.75 milliseconds, no recorded overshoot. Bumping up to the fast setting, again, no concerning amount of overshoot, actually still all green shades in the graph here. The average initial time has dropped from 5.75 milliseconds to 4.93 milliseconds, so a good solid performance here. Using the fastest setting, that does speed things up a little bit, but it's at 60 Hz, you don't really need to speed things up this much, but if you happen to want to be optimizing things in that way, then feel free. But either way, it drops the average initial time from 4.93 milliseconds to 4.03 milliseconds, just slightly improves some of the transition times. It does so without incurring huge overshoot penalties, but for some of the transitions there is a bit of overshoot, which I do actually notice in practice using this fastest setting, so I don't like it at 60 Hz. And also, it's nice to just have one set and forget setting, and fast is really very nicely optimized in my opinion throughout the VRR range, so I would just stick to that. Just another thing to note about all of these graphs I've shown you, I did take some recordings using VRR as well as static refresh rate, and the monitor performed in a similar way regardless, so that's why I don't see the need to go through VRR and static refresh rate separately for these readings. And just a final thing to go through, and back to test UFO for this one, and that is the NPRT sync setting, which is a strobe backlight setting, and that can be used with a refresh rate of 120 Hz, 144 Hz or 160 Hz selected. I'm showing 120 Hz and 160 here. 144 Hz, as you'd imagine, is just somewhere between these two. There's a comparison with the monitor using its fast overdrive setting at 120 Hz, that's the first column, and 160 Hz, that's the third column, with each refresh rate and the NPRT setting. And you can see that the main object is quite a bit clearer, especially at 160 Hz, but even at 120 Hz. But at 160 Hz it's particularly good because you can actually see the little white notches and count them, and actually by eye it's even clearer than it is in this photo. And the segmentation of the UFO is super distinct as well. You can even see aliasing on the lines the black lines that separate the UFO segments. So it certainly does make the image clearer in that respect. There's what's broadly termed strobe crosstalk, so that's the trailing around the UFOs. And I'll explore this a little bit more very shortly, but just keep this in mind. What I'm showing you here is towards the central region of the screen, and it's performing well because the main object is significantly bolder than the strobe crosstalk. A few other things that I'd like to note here. Various settings are restricted when you use MPRT sync, such as brightness, and that's locked at a value of around 230 nits. So that's going to be brighter than some people would like, not as bright as other people would like, but I think for many people it's going to be an acceptable trade-off, on an okay level I should say really, of brightness. Not super dim, not super bright, but individual sensitivities vary. It would have been nicer to be able to adjust that. Response time setting can't be adjusted either. And as the sync part of the name suggests, it can be used with VRR at the same time. It does so down to about 90 Hz, 90 frames a second, and below that MPRT will deactivate and the screen switches to normal VRR operation. As usual for such a setting, there is flickering as the backlight strobes at a frequency matching the refresh rate of the display. Sensitivity to such flickering varies, but there's more potential for this to be bothersome at lower refresh rates, so closer to the 90 Hz floor of operation for the setting. If you're frequently passing the 90 Hz floor in either direction, well, the constant activation and deactivation of MPRT would be annoying, to say the least. Because the monitor uses a quantum dot LED backlight rather than relying on KSF phosphors, you don't get KSF phosphor fringing or flickering issues. So with KSF phosphors, you could see colourful magenta to red fringes or flashes during motion as well of that colour, or green, sometimes cyan looking. Just bright, colourful artefacts which can be quite distracting, especially if you're pretty sensitive to them, as I am. So I much prefer this experience which is free from those kind of issues. And again, the central strobe crosstalk is pretty good. So certainly this is a pretty decent strobe backlight setting in my view. But there is a caveat to that. This image here shows strobe crosstalk throughout the screen. The level of strobe crosstalk does vary from the top to the bottom of the screen. And you can see further up the screen, there's actually significant strobe crosstalk in front of the object, and the object basically melds into the strobe crosstalk and it creates almost a double image, which isn't attractive. Lower down the screen, the strong strobe crosstalk appears behind the image, which isn't ideal either. So the thing to be aware of here is that your eyes will mainly be focusing towards the center of the screen if you're playing FPS games, but if you're playing strategy games or games with scrolling text further up the screen, perhaps combat flight sims, then you'll probably be looking at various different points of the screen, or you will be at different points of the game. So you would notice that stronger strobe crosstalk rather than just having your eyes towards the center of the screen as you generally would, more so in FPS games, certainly competitively speaking. So I would say for those kind of games, rather than FPS gaming, you might find the strobe backlight setting annoying. But either way, strobe backlights, they're quite a niche feature. Most people will be happier to just not use that feature and use the standard operation of the monitor. To wrap up then, in terms of the build quality of the monitor, I thought it was decent, but not incredible. I prefer coated metal stands, I think we're all aware of that by this point. Good ergonomic flexibility, not super generous level of height adjustment, but it does offer tilt, height, swivel and pivot adjustment. The screen size and resolution combination delivers an excellent pixel density, really nice level of detail and clarity provided there. The screen surface doesn't impede that too much as far as matte screen surfaces go. Decent balance in my opinion of glare handling and not too much layering or massive amount of graininess in front of the image or anything like that. The contrast performance, well, it's really as specified, around 1000 to 1 static contrast, moderate amount of IPS glow. On the colour side of things, that's really where the monitor impresses and actually sets itself apart from many of its competitors. With the quantum dot LED backlight solution, it offers a very generous colour gamut with nearly complete DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB coverage. So that makes it very versatile if you want to use this for colour critical work, or if you're someone who just likes strong vibrancy in games and just when using the monitor in general, then this monitor can certainly deliver that. I also found the emulation settings useful to have and pretty good overall. If I'm nitpicking, I would perhaps like to have seen a little bit less of the coverage eaten away using those settings, but they still prevented the over coverage, which was good to see. And if I'm further nitpicking, then yes, it would have been nice to be able to adjust the colour channels and adjust everything with those settings, but it could have been worse. At least you could adjust brightness. The HDR performance of the monitor, not too much to say about that really. It's not a key selling point of the monitor, or certainly shouldn't be. the brightness is just locked at a high level, similar to the SDR brightness. Should mention as well, actually, the brightness adjustment range of this monitor was very impressive. But under HDR, you're getting around 500 nits for the white luminance, and the backlight just stays at that level. There's no local dimming, not even dynamic contrast. So it really does provide a flooded look to darker shades, which is unimpressive, and even to medium shades that are sapped of depth. The colour gamut, I wouldn't really say it's put to good use. I mean, it's certainly put to good use if you like things to look a bit oversaturated and sort of a strong-ish level of vibrancy. I say strong-ish because, again, the lack of dimming precision really does let it down in that respect as well under HDR. But anyway, I mean, there's plenty of pop to quite a few of the shades if you like that kind of thing. But I just think the overall HDR experience is too compromised for most people to want to use it, except for an occasional change of scene, so to speak. The responsiveness of the monitor was actually quite impressive overall. Low input lag, good 160Hz performance. I was pleased to see that VRR worked without any particular issues that I observed, like VRR flickering, and also with a single overdrive mode experience, I could just keep the overdrive set to fast, and that worked well throughout the VRR range. So overall, I do think this is a good monitor. It's well priced, certainly in the US where it's actually available. It doesn't appear to have global availability just yet, but based on US pricing at under $450, I think that's a very fair price for this indeed. One model I'd compare it to would be the Gigabyte M27U, and that's a model I've recommended since reviewing it. So the M27U, it provides superior HDR brightness and contrast with rudimentary 8-zone local dimming, but it's still heavily compromised for HDR. But in many other ways, I feel the MSI is simply the superior product. So it feels a bit more premium overall. I found the stand, in particular of the Gigabyte, a bit sort of on the cheapy, plasticky side. Obviously, I like to tap my stand bases too much on monitors. The MSI has a high USB-C power delivery of 65 watts versus 15 watts. They both have KVM functionality though, that was nice to see. The MSI has full bandwidth HDMI 2.1, which I know some people are particular about. It has a superior brightness adjustment range under SDR with 39 rather than 66 nits minimum and 506 rather than 431 nits maximum. It also has a superior strobe backlight implementation due to the lack of KSF phosphors on the backlight, and the most important differentiator in my view is the true wide gamut support with excellent Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 coverage rather than being restricted, as the Gigabyte is, to around 90% DCI-P3 with far from complete Adobe RGB coverage. This makes it more versatile for colour accurate work, and it can also provide superior vibrancy and saturation if you like that kind of thing. So yeah, I can definitely recommend the MSI as a gaming monitor, and certainly for uses beyond that, and it's definitely one that you should strongly consider. And that's really all there is to the MSI MPG 274URF QD. In the description of the video, you'll find a link to additional content, including information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.